turn of the century, Y2K, skateboarding's influence on pop culture had reached unprecedented new heights. It started popping up in TV, film, music, and emerging internet chatter. But at the heart of it all stood Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Now on its first sequel, it was a phenomenon. Not only was it a great game, but it helped elevate skateboarding in general. And by the end of 2000, it had become a true juggernaut, arguably one of the biggest games in the world. Then comes 2001. Hot off the North American launch of PlayStation 2 in late 2000, 2001 would become one of the most iconic years in gaming history. Metal Gear Solid 2, Halo, Final Fantasy X, Jak and Daxter, Max Payne, Grand Theft Auto 3, Gran Turismo 3, Sonic Adventure 2, Silent Hill 2, Eco, Devil May Cry, Klonoa 2, the list goes on and on. The influence of 2001 still reverberates today, it cannot be understated. As anyone that was playing games during this era knows, even among these titans, few games were as hotly anticipated as Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. Announced for PlayStation 2, it marked the series' leap into the next generation, offering improved visuals, smoother performance, and even full online play. Many regard it as the pinnacle of the franchise, a masterwork that later entries, while still solid, could never quite surpass. In the end, developer Neversoft was shifted over to entirely different projects, and the Tony Hawk series started to fade. That is until Activision revived it in 2020 with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2, full remakes of the original two games that reignited fans' passion for the series. It was one of my favorite games that year. But just months after its release, the news hit. Developer Vicarious Visions, a studio with a deep history rooted in Tony Hawk games, was being absorbed into Blizzard Entertainment, so despite its success, it felt like the end once again. Thankfully, that's not where the story ends, and based on Vicarious Visions' excellent foundation, Iron Galaxy has stepped up to the plate to bring us Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4. Yes, the series is back again. It's not perfect, but it's awesome. To celebrate its return, we're firing up the time machine and going for the full DF retro experience. We're heading back to 2001 where we'll relive the glory days of extreme sports gaming, track the rise and fall of Activision O2, its extreme sports brand, before jumping forward to examine Tony Hawk's latest outing. So, let's get started. To truly understand the impact of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, you only need to look back at what came before and after its release. Skating, an extreme sports game, certainly existed prior to Pro Skater, but their core design was different, typically focusing more on reaching a goal while landing the occasional trick. Games like Sega's Top Skater were a major influence. In fact, this was the original design direction that Pro Skater itself was set to follow. That is until the Neversoft team famously realized how fun it was to chain tricks together in a single bowl at the end of the map. So with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater then, the team stumbled upon a formula that would completely change the genre. As with any major success in gaming, the industry took notice, and by 2001, countless games were following the same blueprint. Unlike today's longer development cycles, new games and sequels could be conceived, built, and released in record time. The response was immediate, and the market experienced a huge boom in skateboarding and other extreme sports games. But success also raised the bar. With the third entry in the Pro Skater series, Neversoft was faced with a new challenge. They not only had to surpass the critically acclaimed Pro Skater 2 just released in the year 2000, but they also had to adapt to a brand new console generation, the PlayStation 2. This was no small feat. The PS2 was notoriously difficult to master early on, and many developers struggled to harness its potential. Neversoft, however, was ready. When Pro Skater 3 was unveiled at E3 2001, the playable demo made it clear that the team knew what they were doing. The jump to a silky smooth 60 frames per second alone was a statement of intent. And then less than 6 months later, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 shipped, reaching store shelves. I was there on day one. Weirdly enough, as somebody already on the internet at the time, one of my standout memories is when Jeff Gerstmann awarded the game a perfect 10 out of 10 on GameSpot.com. It resonated with many of us over on the Gaming Age forums, as it was called at the time, and honestly, I completely agree. Pro Skater 3 is a 10 out of 10. Even in a year as stacked as 2001, it really does stand out as one of the most timeless releases. It's a game that you can pick up and play right now, and it's still just as fun. Really, everything about the gameplay just clicks. The level design, goals, controls, the fluidity of the gameplay. If the manual in Pro Skater 2 defined the combo system, then the revert in Pro Skater 3 completed it, allowing players to seamlessly continue lines from vert ramps across large stages. Combine that with an iconic soundtrack and you have Tony Hawk perfected. Even crazier, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 is the first PlayStation 2 game with full online play support. The official adapter was not even on the market at this time, requiring USB adapters instead, but it was possible to enjoy the game back online all the way back in 2001. Now, from the Digital Foundry perspective, the jump to PlayStation 2 was indeed pivotal. Neversoft transitioned from its own internal technology to the renderware engine. This is the same tech that would go on to power Burnout and Grand Theft Auto. So with the graphics now powered by this enhanced technology, when you compare this to the original two games, there's a huge leap. Pro Skater 3 eliminates distance fog entirely for one, meaning entire stages are now visible from corner to corner. Not only does it look fantastic, but it also makes reading the environment and planning combos, of course, a lot easier. Polygon counts were also boosted. Ramps and half-pipes were now smoothly rendered with minimal visible polygon edges, unlike the PlayStation games. The awkward zombie-like models that filled the PlayStation 1 games also were replaced, with skaters finally beginning to resemble themselves. And, of course, the textures no longer warped and stretched as you move, plus were just a lot more detailed. I remember loading it up for the first time and seeing the Foundry stage, the Adolescence song Amoeba playing. It honestly blew me away, being able to see all the way across the stage and just seeing all that polygonal detail stretched way across the map. It was awesome. Seriously, going from like 20 to 30 frames per second in those original PlayStation games, full of foggy levels and unstable textures, to a rock solid, or mostly rock solid, 60 frames per second with such massively enhanced visuals, it was one of the biggest leaps that I'd ever seen. Even in the face of the excellent Dreamcast conversions of the original two games, it was a huge upgrade. After all, those were still limited by that original Tony Hawk engine. But the thing is, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, as big as it was, also formed a part of Activision's ambitions. It was the basis of what would become known as Activision O2, its bespoke extreme sports brand. The logo first appeared on certain PC copies of Pro Skater 2, but only on the case, while its proper debut occurred in May of 2001, well before the third Tony Hawk game, with Matt Hoffman's Pro BMX for PlayStation, Dreamcast, and the like. This game boasts stylistically consistent branding with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater series, but the BMX focus showed clear intent at expanding beyond the typical skate park. Now, all of this makes a lot of sense given the popularity of other extreme sports games at the time, beyond Tony Hawk. EA's SSX, for instance, was a smash hit at the launch of PlayStation 2. Matt Hoffman's BMX is a solid attempt at bringing the Pro Skater formula over to a new format on a bike, and developer Shaba Games would go on to directly work on that series as well. Heck, they got their start with Grind Session, published by Sony itself on the original PlayStation. A decent little game in its own right. Now, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 was, of course, the headline game for the O2 brand, but it also heralded the arrival of another game shortly after, with Sean Palmer's Pro Snowboarder. This game released just a few weeks after Pro Skater 3, and in fact, Pro Skater 3 itself includes a demo of the game right on the DVD. This is one of the more interesting releases in the O2 lineup, having been developed in Japan by remnants of UEP Systems, the studio behind the Cool Borders series. UEP had already cut its teeth on PlayStation 2 with Cool Borders Code Alien, a Japan-exclusive snowboarding game for the system. But Pro Snowboarder was something else entirely. It's a unique blend of Japanese-style design with Western trimmings. You have the likes of Papa Roach and Static X there, along with the Pro Skater goal system, combined with some slick Japanese-style snowboarding action. They even simulate moving cloth as you make your way down the mountain with the wind slicing through their coats. It's a guilty pleasure of mine, and I love playing it to this day. And of course, it's a smooth 60 frames per second. Fun fact, some of the staff, including the game's director, would go on to create Ridge Racers for PSP, Ridge Racer 6 for Xbox 360, and Ridge Racer 7 for the PS3. Oh, for Namco, of course. So, the director on those games also directed Sean Palmer. But at the time, in 2001, both games really failed to capture the same audience as Neversoft. They were good, but not Neversoft good. It was not an easy thing to recreate the kind of gameplay that we saw in the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater franchise up to that point. So naturally, Tony Hawk 3 started its world tour across a wide variety of different hardware platforms. Just like the original games, PlayStation was just the beginning. Hawk 3 would later be ported to Xbox, Nintendo GameCube, the PC, portable consoles, and even last generation machines, before arriving this year inside Tony Hawk's 3 and 4. So, no time was wasted in spreading the brand. Which brings us to our first DF Retro showdown of the day. How does it compare to the other versions? Well, the GameCube version launched first alongside the system in late November, just a month after the game on PlayStation 2. It's not an exclusive, but it was one heck of a game to have available on day one, and frankly, this port's pretty good. Pro Skater 3 is visually almost on par or slightly superior to the PlayStation 2 version, depending how you look at it. There's both good and bad here. The color depth is a little higher, so there's less dithering than on PlayStation 2. It also employs a flicker filter, which may or may not be a positive, depending on who you ask, and it runs smoothly. Unfortunately, the bitmap selection bias seems to be set rather high on the GameCube version, but essentially it means that textures on oblique surfaces such as the ground appear much blurrier than they do on PlayStation 2. The assets are the same, but as you can see in this example here, the low-resolution bitmaps kick in right near the player, which I think has quite a negative impact on the overall visual quality in this game. Neither version supports 480p out of the box, but using either OpenPS2 Loader's GSM feature or Swiss on the GameCube, you can enable 480p in both cases, which is how I'm playing it here for best capture quality. Both manage 60 frames per second nearly all the time as well, which is great. The main issue with the GameCube version really comes down to controls. I mean, they're not bad per se, but the GameCube controller itself feels a little weird for Tony Hawk, and I just couldn't really get my head around it. It didn't feel great. But this is something that's going to vary from person to person. The Xbox version of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 then launched a few months later in March of 2002. And it's clear right away that this port did receive some extra polish, including a brand new stage, the oil rig. Now on the surface, it looks similar to the PlayStation 2 and GameCube versions, but under the hood, there have been several visual upgrades. Most notably, this version appears to use actual anti-aliasing, dramatically improving image quality. It also supports native 480p output without the need for additional homebrew software, unlike the other two versions. So image quality is a lot better. Beyond that, many textures have been upgraded to a higher quality. Not every asset, mind you, but the improvements on the main textures are noticeable and appreciated. But other than that, it is pretty much the same game, just slightly upgraded. And for those reasons, I would say the Xbox Edition is often considered the definitive version of Pro Skater 3. There's only one caveat here, the controller. At launch, the only option was the original Duke controller, which many found ill-suited for precision skateboard gameplay. But of course, controller preferences are personal, and you can use other console controllers with the Xbox these days. Outside of these consoles, however, Pro Skater 3 saw a native release for Windows and Mac OS. To evaluate the PC port, we ran it on era-appropriate hardware, a Pentium 4 3GHz paired with a GeForce 4 Ti 4800 running Windows XP. It's configured for 1024x768 resolution with maximum visual settings. Performance is surprisingly excellent, holding a stable 60 frames per second on this machine. There's also a difference with shadow rendering, where all the shadows appear pitch black on PC. Given the proximity to its release date, perhaps the developers had seen the Doom 3 tech demos just prior. There's also some weirdness with alpha blended textures, like the clouds here in the background on the Canada stage. It's drawn overly dark on the PC version versus the other consoles. Alas, it does not include the Xbox exclusive content or textures, but it's still a robust version with great image quality. But the key here is that every major release of Pro Skater 3, whether on console or PC, sustained a high level of quality. This was certainly not a guarantee back then, so it was refreshing to see it handled so well. But we've only covered the ports derived from the PlayStation 2 version, the actual Neversoft game. But Pro Skater 3 also landed on then last generation consoles and the Game Boy Advance. So how did it fare? Well, going back all the way to 2001 and released alongside its cutting-edge PS2 cousin, Pro Skater 3 came to the original PlayStation, the birthplace of the first two entries in the franchise. This entry comes to us from none other than Shaba Games, the same studio behind Grind Session and Matt Hoffman's Pro BMX. And what a challenge it must have been, because they've adapted many of the same maps from the PlayStation 2 game using the base technology that powered Pro Skater 2. Straight away, the menu tries to mimic the look of the PS2 version, but it's built around static backgrounds rather than full 3D polygon scenes with a lot of loading screens between each menu. Once in game, the compromises become even more apparent. These are not the same maps from PlayStation 2, they've instead been entirely rebuilt, using a much lower polygon count and level of detail. Affine texture warping persists, and the draw distance is significantly reduced. On larger maps like Los Angeles or the suburbs, it can almost feel disorienting as visibility is so dramatically limited. Again, the maps were not designed for this, which makes it extra challenging to play. Naturally, performance takes a hit too, with the frame rate often dropping below 30 frames per second, much like its predecessors. Ultimately, the maps were clearly conceived for hardware more capable than the PlayStation, and dialing them back this far undermines the whole experience. Despite these technical shortcomings, however, it's still a solid Tony Hawk game at its heart, just one that reminds us how far cross-generation ports had evolved since the early days. But would you believe that months later, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 would also arrive on Nintendo 64, a system that was pretty much dead at that point? In fact, in summer 2002, when Pro Skater 3 came out, it would be the final North American N64 game. Like the first two titles, this port was handled by Edge of Reality, a studio formed by one of the programmers on Turok Dinosaur Hunter. At first glance, it looks just like a PlayStation version of the game running on N64, but despite some specific cutbacks, I'd argue that the experience is overall a lot better. So firstly, it cleans up the PlayStation's graphics. The textures are of course cleaner with actual filtering, along with proper perspective correction. The frame rate is a lot more stable, and the game boasts actual anti-aliasing. So it's a cleaner, better performing version of the game all around. And in fact, I was fairly impressed by the whole thing. Even the N64 controller itself offers a decent Tony Hawk experience if you use the D-pad. There's just one real limitation with this version, the sound. Due to limitations of the cart, the dev team was not able to squeeze the full soundtrack in, so instead, we get a handful of ultra-compressed, shortened snippets that fail to do justice to that original soundtrack, though it can be pretty funny at times. So PS1 and N64 are ultimately interesting and fun on their own terms, and I can see why these ports were made, but they don't really stack up to the PlayStation 2 original. But what if you wanted to play on the go? Well, that's where Vicarious Vision's Game Boy Advance port comes in. Just like their work on Tony Hawk 2, this version adapts the basic concepts of the third game into an isometric skating title, featuring a 3D polygon character that you control. They've properly implemented the controls based on the original game code, and as a result it does actually feel genuinely authentic, but with a different viewpoint. However, next to Tony Hawk 2's Game Boy Advance port, I felt that the levels on which this version is based were simply a little too complex, and the spatial reading of them became a little confusing at times. It's really just not an easy game to read, and as a result, not as enjoyable as the proper 3D games or even Tony Hawk 2. Given the limitations of the platform, I think they did good work here, but it's definitely my least favorite version of the game to play. Or almost. You see, there's one more left to discuss, and that's Hot Gen Studios' conversion for the Game Boy Color. That's right, like Tony Hawk 1 and 2 before it, the third game also received a Game Boy Color conversion, and it's not bad. Primarily, the game plays from a side-scrolling perspective, but if you hold up an invert ramp, it takes you to the second layer, allowing for some fairly complex, layered levels. It still kind of mimics the structure of the main game, but is obviously simplified. In terms of mechanics, it's quite different from the Natsume-developed Tony Hawk 1 and 2 on Game Boy Color, arguably more faithful to the console games. Unfortunately, it only runs at 30 frames per second, but despite that, the game still manages to look and animate pretty well given the platform, and it's about the best you could realistically hope for. The Game Boy Advance game that we just looked at is certainly more faithful, but I find these sorts of demakes to be rather interesting in their own right, and this one's no exception. Now with that though, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 would go quiet as Activision moved on to the next mainline installment. We wouldn't see Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 return again until 2025, which finally brings us to Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4 for modern platforms. Now, this specific release is precisely what sparked the creation of this video, and honestly I have to say, Iron Galaxy did a great job here. Like 1 and 2 before it, this remake delivers the modern Tony Hawk experience fans have been craving, faithful to the original, visually stunning, and mechanically tight. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, the last of the traditional goal-based entries in the series, fits seamlessly into this framework. It's built on Unreal Engine 4, and the game features fully remade visuals with sharp detail and a moody October vibe, with deep orange hues, long shadows, and a tone that feels just right. And that's key, right? The environmental rendering is genuinely fantastic in this new version of the game, with every level boasting beautifully detailed environments full of smoothly curved ramps, bowls, and rails. Modern technology has allowed the artists to unleash beautiful new lighting and effects work across the board, which really helps increase the atmosphere. Brazil's colorful skate park now really pops in this new entry, especially when played on an HDR display. It's inviting yet striking at the same time. Meanwhile, LA boasts detailed streets and corners ready for tricking, while towering skyscrapers encircle the player, enhancing that feeling of skating in a small area within a huge city. It's gorgeous. And let's not forget Tokyo, with its striking neon signs everywhere and smoothly rendered ramps. This nighttime course absolutely soars with HDR enabled, and if you haven't played it in a while, it might even look just as you remember it. But flip over to the PlayStation 2 original, and yeah, the differences are clear. It feels both modern yet familiar at the same time. The most profound changes stem from the game's color choices and attempts to sort of flesh out each environment. In the original, everything's got this sort of like grayish, monochromatic hue to it, but the remake goes crazy with colors, especially in stages like Brazil here. And even those that are more closely matched to the original game still feel like a nice improvement overall. Considering that overhauling the visuals was basically a huge part of why this was made in the first place, I do think, like Tony Hawk's 1 and 2 before it, they've done a phenomenal job here. I was surprised by some of the reactions online though. I saw complaints about the UI being too corporate now, devoid of creativity if you will. I think it's very much a matter of opinion. Take the UI in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. I like what they're going for, but if you actually look closely at any of the text, you'll see that it's all upscaled from a much lower resolution source and the quality is quite blurry. So while it's conceptually cool, it doesn't actually look very good at all. They complain that the letters don't bleed off the screen like in Tony Hawk 3. Well, they didn't do that in Tony Hawk 4 either. But we always go through this every time a new game is remade. And thankfully, the original is still very much accessible if you want to play it. And I think all the new versions of the levels look absolutely excellent. Is it perfect? Not necessarily, but I do think they've done good work. Now, like Tony Hawk 1 and 2, this game is available on just about everything. And based on my testing, there really aren't any major technical differences between 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So things like resolution, image quality, frame rate, all of that is consistent between them, as if this is a direct continuation, which it kind of is. The only real new addition this time is a Switch 2 version, which did not exist for the last game, obviously. And this one is not bad. It drops the resolution down to 1080p docked and uses traditional TAA, not DLSS. Now UE4's TAA isn't great, so the game looks a little muddy in motion, but overall it's not bad and reminds me of the last generation version. It also runs at 60 frames per second this time and even supports HDR. So it's a huge improvement over the Switch 1 version. Alas, the soundtrack has been refreshed as well, and this has become somewhat of a sticking point for many fans. For whatever reason, this new version is missing many of the music tracks that were included in the original Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, replaced instead with a whole slew of new songs. Personally, I'm okay with the change. I've heard that original soundtrack many times before and was honestly ready for something new. And it's not like all the original tracks are gone either, but I can understand why it might be a disappointment if you're coming back to the series riding that nostalgia wave. The key for me though is that returning to Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 once again with a fresh coat of paint was immensely satisfying, like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2 before it. It really is one of the best score attack games ever made. Just a true masterwork across the board. When you look at how many different versions of Tony Hawk 3 exist up through the modern era, it's also remarkable to consider how nearly all of them are, at minimum, good, with most of them being excellent. But that begs the question, where do you go from perfection? How does one top a game as good as Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3? Well, to understand this, we need to go back in time once again, the post-Hawk 3 era. The players are assembled. PlayStation 2 is dominating the market, while Xbox and GameCube have both just roared out of the starting gate. The new generation of gaming is on its way. After a jam-packed 2001, 2002 is a bit of a slower year, but that doesn't mean there's not some amazing games. It was also the year that it became clear that if you wanted to compete in the now popular extreme sports genre, you needed to hang with the best, which is something Activision soon discovered the hard way. You see, 2002 is the last official year of Activision O2. There were 3 games bearing the Activision O2 branding, and all of them arrived in the second half of 2002. The results are mixed. Matt Hoffman came first with a sequel to Pro BMX by a different developer. This time it was developed by Rainbow Studios, a company that had made serious waves with a slew of off-road racing games such as Motocross Madness and ATV Off-Road Fury, as well as its water sports series, Splashdown. The other game is Kelly Slater's Pro Surfer, developed by Treyarch. Yes, that Treyarch. Both games are perfectly serviceable, I would say. Compared to Tony Hawk, they attempt to bring players closer to the respective cover figures, often leaning on FMV sequences or other framing concepts, so there's a little bit more going on here. Pro BMX 2 offers a nice selection of rather large environments and solid mechanics, clearly adopted from the Hawk games, while Pro Surfer feels a little more experimental as they needed to adapt surfing into a video game, something that had been done before but not always to great success. Of the two, I definitely prefer BMX 2 for its Hawk-adjacent design. It retains much of what I love about those earlier Pro Skater titles, yet it's adapted for BMX riding. It's more enjoyable and prettier than something like, say, Acclaim's BMX XXX, though, hey, to be fair, they also put out the rather enjoyable Aggressive Inline, so they were doing okay. The weirdest thing with Matt Hoffman's second outing is that while the game generally keeps everything very straight-faced throughout, even more than Tony Hawk, you eventually faced a twist. The game basically turns into a first-person shooter with the player picking up a weapon to take on a flying tiki god of sorts. You basically end up running around the map on foot collecting health and ammo while whittling down its health. It's a super weird way to end the game, that's for sure, but kind of interesting. Pro Surfer in comparison is a lot more straightforward overall, with a focus on execution while riding the waves, which also kind of means that variety comes from the objectives themselves, as there's really not much in the way of proper level design. Unfortunately, unlike Tony Hawk 3 and Sean Palmer's game from 2001, both of these new O2 titles struggled heavily with frame rate, at least on PlayStation 2 here. BMX 2 is just 30 frames per second, while Pro Surfer is uncapped and unstable. So compared to what Neversoft had been doing, these games didn't run all that well, they didn't look that great, nor did they offer anything especially new. And as a result, they didn't really make a huge splash, so all eyes shifted towards Neversoft's next release, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4. Now, by this point, Neversoft had perfected the classic Tony Hawk formula, you could say. You have this list of objectives to accomplish in each map, which you can then use to upgrade your character, followed by high score chasing. It's pure arcade goodness, yet after 3 games, it seems that they wanted to mix things up, and Tony Hawk 4 started us down this path. Essentially, rather than simply presenting a series of goals for each map, the goals themselves are integrated into the map itself. That is, you skate up to mission givers and take on challenges seamlessly without any real loading times. This meant you could freely explore the map without any time limits, with the time limit only appearing when you accepted a mission. It was the first step towards creating a more concentrated and seamless experience. But did it work? Well, yes and no. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 nails that laid-back vibe of cruising around a location, gradually mastering each map while chasing objectives. That core experience is still a good time. Mechanically, Pro Skater 4 builds on the foundation of previous entries, retaining key features while adding some new ones, though none match the impact of the manual or the revert. The standout addition this time is the spline transfer, which allows smooth transitions between quarter pipes. Skitching also joins the mix, allowing you to latch on to moving vehicles, or animals for that matter, while trying to maintain balance. Speaking of which, the career mode also features pedestrians and animals populating the levels for the first time. Previous games felt comparatively lifeless, with only vehicles occasionally driving around. On paper, these changes sound great, but the new goal system introduces some friction. Unlike earlier titles where you could chase multiple objectives in a single 2-minute run, Pro Skater 4 limits you to 1 goal at a time. Completing it abruptly ends the event, prompting a save or character upgrade. It's a jarring break in momentum, and it makes the UI feel somewhat intrusive at times. I'd argue that this concept wouldn't really fully click until the Underground series. And this is fundamentally my biggest issue with the game. The campaign is good, but it's not all that fun to replay, and there's a lot of tedium involved. It just doesn't have that same pick up and play energy as the first 3 titles. Thankfully, the maps themselves are still a highlight. Many feature excellent layouts with creative lines and trick opportunities. Kona is one of my favorites, with a beautifully realized skate park area created in the new engine. It's awesome. The maps themselves are also slightly larger than before, but they still feel well suited to the classic 2-minute runs. Keep this in mind for later. Curiously, the console versions include a Chicago map, which was actually lifted straight from Matt Hoffman's Pro BMX 2. Comparing the two showcases Neversoft's technical edge at the time, with double the frame rate and more attractive visuals. This map plays okay in BMX 2, but it's kind of dull for Tony Hawk, as there's a lot of large open flat areas and not much action in terms of linking tricks together. Speaking of tech, Pro Skater 4 sees some nice upgrades. For starters, you've got improved image quality and native 16:9 widescreen support. The PlayStation 2 and GameCube versions are quite comparable this time, but really it's the Xbox version that steals the show. This is the first Tony Hawk game to natively support 720p HD, which was an incredible feat for 2002. If you had the right setup, namely an HD TV and component cables for your Xbox, it looked stunning. Despite the Xbox controller being less than ideal for Tony Hawk, this was still my favorite version back in the day, just for its 720p support. In addition, the Xbox version also features shell textured grass rendering, which was first seen in Tony Hawk 2 X at launch. Compared to the flat textures on other platforms, the grass just looks awesome on Xbox, though it can cause some frame rate dips in the HD mode. Add in the faster loading times and custom soundtracks, and it's easily the best version of the game in my book. The PC version mirrors the PS2 and GameCube versions, but supports higher resolutions and includes some graphic settings like distance fog, handy for lower spec machines and a nice touch. In fact, the fog lends the game a very different vibe that feels somewhere between the original PlayStation versions and the current iteration of the series. Now, on the handheld front, Vicarious Visions returns, delivering an excellent isometric GBA version just as before, It's still a good game, and it still continues with the model established from Pro Skater 2 on the GBA. But what's interesting about this one is that a company called Semi-Logic Interactive ported the GBA game to something called the Tapwave Zodiac, a niche PDA gaming hybrid, just a couple years later. Unfortunately, I never got my hands on one of these things, but the footage here on YouTube suggests that it runs slower than the GBA version, making it a bit of a dud. There's also mentions of other versions of the game around the internet. For instance, the obscure Linux-based Digiblast, a Dutch console with few releases, apparently had a version, though I can't find any evidence that it actually released. And there was apparently a Java version called THPS3 Street, which again, may be lost to time or simply never existed as well. This was a very strange era for game preservation, especially when dealing with Java and feature phones. So yeah, Tony Hawk explored some strange platforms during this era. It's just a shame I couldn't personally get my hands on all of them. Speaking of oddities, Pro Skater 4 also landed on the original PlayStation. Yep, with the N64 now out of the picture, the series wasn't done with last generation just yet and took one last lap on the PlayStation. This time, Vicarious Visions handled this conversion, squeezing in as much as the aging platform could possibly handle. Quite frankly, they did such a good job with this that in some ways it exceeds the original. What do I mean? Well, they managed to keep the mission structure intact, but didn't have the resources to display characters, so goals are only displayed as icons. That doesn't sound better, right? Well, here's the thing. When you accept or complete missions in this version, the game doesn't interrupt you as it does in normal Pro Skater 4. You just cruise up, hit circle, and start going. When you complete an objective, the game reports what you've done, and you just continue. Of course, it also means the world feels emptier, and there's really not that much going on here, but I thought it was better in terms of pure gameplay. Of course, by this point, the old PlayStation engine was showing its limitations. They did a great job translating the maps to PlayStation, but doing so required shrinking them down. Alas, I didn't get much time to play this one, but I enjoyed it enough that I probably will go back after this video. All told, Pro Skater 4 has roughly the same number of releases as the prior game, and scales similarly well. But despite this, the reception was certainly cooler. The game sold well, but significantly less than Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. Was it the changes made to the format, or were people simply growing tired of virtual skating? Whatever the reason, the series would march on, making further changes to the formula from this point, including aligning itself more closely with the hijinks of Jackass. But with the release of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4, we have a chance to reevaluate the fourth game. Or at least that's what we thought initially. You see, as we know now, in building this new version of the game, Activision opted to make drastic changes to Pro Skater 4. Rather than recreating the original single-player mode, the game was rebuilt in the classic model with a series of goals and a 2-minute timer. When this was announced, a lot of fans were bummed, but others, such as myself, were more intrigued. You see, as I mentioned earlier, I never really felt that Pro Skater 4's single-player mode worked all that well. Thug would take the concept and do it a lot better, but the fourth game kind of feels like a prototype in some ways. Yet with the larger maps, there was also a concern that maybe the classic formula wouldn't work all that well. In the end though, I would argue that it does actually work, but it's not without fault. So I love that we get to skate these maps using classic rules. It allows the game to be played in a way that the original never could, and playing through the campaign is a lot less tedious for me. Like, that's the thing with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. I could sit down, select any of the characters I hadn't played through yet, and just go through the entire game in one sitting and have a blast, but you could never really do that with the fourth game. Now, you kinda can, and that rules. But at the same time, this is coming from someone that knows the maps well already. So if you weren't already familiar with the fourth game, it's possible that the size of these maps might actually be an issue. But of course, you can always use Freeskate to explore and learn them first. At the same time, there's arguments to be made that they've failed to preserve the original game and have made something entirely different as a result, which is also true. But at the same time, those originals still exist, so I'm kind of split on this whole thing. If they decide to continue with this path of remaking classic Hawk games though, they're going to have to figure it out, because Tony Hawk's Underground without the proper missions really wouldn't be the same game. At least there's some cool new content here. Firstly, the water park map. This one is brand new, and my goodness, it's gorgeous. It replaces the Carnival and Chicago maps, which have gone missing, and frankly, I think it's a lot better than both of them. There's just so much to see in this map. It's really beautifully designed, and I've always had a thing for abandoned water parks. I was instantly attracted to this place. The only real issue here is that it perhaps relies a little too much on warp points to get to the tops of slides, similar to Alcatraz, but I still love skating it. Then there's the movie set map, which is arguably the best new map in the game. I prefer the look of the water park, but the movie set perfectly encapsulates what makes maps from Tony Hawk 2 and 3 so great. It takes place within a very tightly confined area with so many things to trick off of. It's just an incredibly rewarding map to play. There's also this pinball level, which it's a bit less successful, but interesting nonetheless. But alright, how does it compare visually to the originals? Well, quite favorably. In fact, I would say that the glow up is more successful with Tony Hawk 4 than with the third game. You see, the original release was already less stylized than 3, and it could appear a little flat at times. This new release injects some much needed color into the world, creating something that's just bursting with thick, beautiful atmosphere. Truly fantastic stuff. However, they didn't just remake the levels and call it a day. In order to make the formula work, the new levels feature plenty of extra ramps and trick spots, allowing them to work better within the classic Hawk formula. This is most strongly felt in maps like the Zoo, which is missing areas entirely and changed to work as a competition map instead. I actually kind of think it flows better like this, to be honest. But if we set aside direct comparisons for a moment, what really stands out is the sheer level of detail. Arguably even more impressive than the maps in Pro Skater 3, the environments feel vibrant and alive, yet they remain easy to read despite the bump in visual fidelity. Scanning across the map reveals clean, well-structured geometry with intuitive lines, making it easy to spot objectives and trick opportunities from a distance. I can certainly understand why some fans might prefer the original, but I still think they did an excellent job here and it's worth checking out. In fact, in some ways I'd argue this is a better Pro Skater 4 than the original. Now, of course, that original had to exist for the series to evolve, so it's not really a fair comparison, but the new focus allows everything to sort of flow a lot faster and made it easier to get into the action. It's now a more replayable game, I feel. But that's Pro Skater 4 then. A solid game that changed the entire trajectory of the series, and now one that brings that classic feeling back. But if we rewind back to 2002, I mentioned earlier that this was essentially the final chapter for Activision O2, but that's not entirely accurate. You see, included with Pro Skater 4 is a small booklet highlighting the Activision O2 brand. Most of the expected titles were there, but on the final pages of the booklet, you'll actually find 3 lesser-known entries. Sean Palmer's Pro Snowboarder 2, Sean Murray's Pro Wakeboarder, and Travis Pastrana's Pro Moto X. So what are these? Well, sadly, Sean Palmer's Pro Snowboarder 2 never happened. There's a small YouTube channel called Activision O2 channel, which kind of catalogs some of this stuff, and they actually have a rare trailer of Sean Palmer's Pro Snowboarder 2, but it's just FMV. Alas, this one was being developed by Treyarch, which at this point didn't have the best track record, and it likely would have been a worse game than the original. Pro Wakeboarder, though, actually appeared as a demo bundled with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 on the PlayStation 2, similar to how Pro Snowboarder 1 was introduced. The demo features a single level where players could perform tricks while zipping around a wakeboarding course. It looks awesome. And the full game did indeed launch in 2003, but under a new name, Wakeboarding Unleashed, featuring Sean Murray. While the Activision O2 branding can be observed, the actual title and cover art no longer follows the house style. So sometime between the booklet from Pro Skater 4 and the release of Wakeboarding Unleashed, Activision started to retire the O2 label. This was the final game to bear that symbol. The tech behind Wakeboarding Unleashed, though, is genuinely impressive. Reflections, water effects, the whole package. This one was actually developed by Shaba Games, which we've already mentioned multiple times thus far, and honestly I was floored to see this running on a PlayStation 2. It looked a lot better than I expected, and way better than Pro Surfer. Like, the water effects and the scenery rendering here are so good that it could have passed as an early Xbox 360 game if not for the resolution. As for Travis Pastrana's Pro Moto X, well, that game also saw release, but in 2004, and this time it was rebranded as MTX Motor Tracks. Now, the O2 branding was gone. This one was developed by Left Field Productions, the same company that had, just a few years prior, developed Excite Bike 64 for Nintendo 64. These guys had been around for a while, dating back to the 3DO era with Slam and Jam 95, but they did really great work here. This is a fantastic game, delivering fast-paced motorbike action at 60 frames per second across a wide range of motocross and supercross tracks. It actually reminds me of some of the Rainbow Studios games, especially Motocross Madness, but taken to the next level perhaps. But with its release, that was the final breath of the once promising Activision O2 brand, the last game to have ever been associated with it. Unfortunately, it sort of represented a trend. You see, by 2005, 2006 or so, the landscape had kind of shifted. EA would soon shutter the EA Sports big label, the Activision O2 brand was certainly now gone, and Acclaim, which had its own extreme sports brand, had vanished entirely. It was a rough time for fans of these extreme sports titles that just 5 years earlier had basically dominated the industry. Thankfully, things are looking up. With the return of Tony Hawk in the last few years, the rebirth of Skate from Electronic Arts, and a wave of nostalgia hitting for this specific era, we might be in the middle of a revival. Of course, it could also go the other way if these things don't hit with fans. Whatever happens next though, it's great to have a new Tony Hawk game this year, and here's hoping the momentum continues for years to come.